the nature of life and the nature of perioperative practice is that so many things are gray. So we try to do our best to give solid direction in those areas of gray. And that almost always involves assembling an interdisciplinary team to look at the research together and have every piece of the question answered by the person who has the expertise to answer the question.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this week's episode of First Case, we are joined by none other than Erin Kyle, the editor-in-chief of the AORN Guidelines for Perioperative Practice, and we are going to be talking all things AORN Guidelines, from how they get written, how they get researched, to how we can implement them and what resources are available. Erin is going to take us through the steps, walk us through the process, and she's also going to help clear up some misunderstandings and some misconceptions along the way. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Erin Kyle.
Hi, I'm Chris Blevins.
And I'm Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Erin Kyle. Erin is the editor-in-chief of the AORN Guidelines for Perioperative Practice. And Erin, it is a privilege to have you in the studio today. You and I have chatted briefly before. I've seen you at various events. I've seen you at Expo. I've seen you at the Guidelines workshops, which are really cool, by the way. And you really do just seem to know everything there is to know about everything. So maybe I'm going to be a little fangirly today as we have our conversation about the guidelines, but I'm super excited to get to talk to you about this topic. I mean, the guidelines are huge, right? They influence so much of what we do, but to get to talk about them and talk about understanding them is, I think, a really important conversation. And while our conversation today is all about the AORN guidelines, before we jump into the guidelines, let's get to know you, right? So why don't you just take a minute to introduce yourself to everyone?
Melanie, it's great to be with you today. I'm always happy to talk about the guidelines. I could probably talk about the guidelines indefinitely, and maybe that's a little bit nerdy, but I'm okay with it. And if you are too, then we can just jump right in. You said I seem to know everything about everything. I definitely don't want to disappoint you today. So I'll do my best to answer all of your questions about the ins and outs of the AORN guidelines.
So when we talk about the guidelines today, we're really looking at them in this greater theme, answering the question for our season, how do I understand the guidelines? How do I potentially implement certain guidelines? How do I really wrap my brain around all of the information that guidelines book encompasses? So there's a lot of things that we're going to maybe touch on a little bit and pick your brain about as we talk about the guidelines today. And as the editor-in-chief, I'm assuming that all the guidelines come across your desk before they go into publication. So you see them all and you see all of the information that AORN is putting out, right?
Yes, I do. I see all of the information all along the way. I'm involved with the guidelines development process, and guidelines development, you'll be probably not surprised to know, has guidelines. So there are guidelines for developing guidelines, which I love. So we follow the National Academies of Medicine's Guidelines We Can Trust recommendations. That was published in 2011, and it's still very relevant today. So we have 6 guideline authors that are perioperative practice specialists at AORN. So our organization is unique in that we have on staff guideline developers and guideline authors. And the majority of them have either a PhD or DNP, PhD in nursing or DNP. And the ones who don't are in programs to achieve that educational level now. So we are blessed to have this much education and background, putting all of their time and effort into guideline development. That's unique to us. There are other organizations that do guidelines development, and it's done through a team on a volunteer basis a lot of the time. And the guideline authors just don't get to focus all of their efforts in the way that we do. And we think that is a real gift and a blessing. It matters. It makes a difference in the way that guidelines are. The focus that we can give improves the quality.
100% agree. Yeah, absolutely agree. If you're focused on it, you can really pour all of your time, effort, and energy into it, putting out a quality, thorough product. And that's what we want in perioperative care. We want the best, and we want to have all of the information at our fingertips when we're going to look at whatever the latest and greatest is in best practice. I'm curious, though, kind of a side question. As you have looked at all the guidelines and everything's come across your desk, has there been anything that you just really didn't know and that you learned because of being the editor of the guidelines?
I learn something every single day. I learn things about clinical applications of the research that comes through our process. I learn things about guidelines development. I learn things about interdisciplinary teamwork. That's what is absolutely the best thing about my job. I get to learn every day, and I get to spend most of my time with some of the most brilliant nurses I've ever met. So yeah, definitely learn something every day. And something always surprises me. I can't think of an example of something that surprised me lately. Oh, here's something that surprises me. We published an update to the guideline for sterile technique recently, within the past year and a half. And I would have assumed that there is a large amount of research evidence that tells us exactly how much air contamination matters in the operating room when it comes to it becoming a risk for surgical site infection. As it turns out, there is no clear evidence that points in a solid direction about how much contamination, and I'm talking about the particles that are in the air. How do you measure those things? Where do you measure the things? Does it matter what type of air delivery system you have in the operating room? Well, so in that guideline update, we found that definitely air quality matters. We all know that. But we didn't have enough evidence to say to our audience that you should always measure these things in this way on this schedule to ensure that you are doing all that you can to reduce your patient's risk of surgical site infection. There are too many other variables that are at play, and the research evidence gave some insights, but didn't give that black and white answer. And not having a black and white answer is probably the thing that we don't love the most about guideline development. We want all of the research evidence to point clearly in a direction so that we can give everyone a very clear answer about what to do always, all of the time. But the nature of life and the nature of perioperative practice is that so many things are gray. So we try to do our best to give solid direction in those areas of gray. And that almost always involves assembling an interdisciplinary team to look at the research together and have every piece of the question answered by the person who has the expertise to answer the question.
That is really interesting. And it does lead me to my next question, because you talk about the person with the expertise and thinking about the guidelines authors and the people that are on your team and the expertise that they bring to the table while they are working on these guidelines. Are they all nurses who have previously worked in the operating room?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Good.
Every nurse on our team has been a perioperative nurse in various roles. Many of them were educators in their past. Most of them have done some board running, including me. That was my favorite
That's a fun job,
by the way. Oh my goodness. We've been leaders. We've worked in quality. So we have a really great mix of perioperative nursing experience that we bring to the discussions that we have. And while we're talking about the interdisciplinary team, I want to highlight the importance of our guidelines advisory board. we are guideline authors, but we don't do our work in a silo. We involve the participation of an interdisciplinary group that are volunteers on the Guidelines Advisory Board. Now, there are 8 perioperative nurse members that are AORN members. Co-chairs are AORN nurse members, but we also have liaison organizations who participate in guidelines development and also offer up their expertise when we're talking about especially these gray areas where the evidence doesn't point in a solid, clear, black and white direction all of the time. Some of those interdisciplinary team members are, we have the American College of Surgeons, we have ASA, we have AANA, we have HSPA for our sterilization collection of guidelines, and many others. I can't list all of them because I don't have the list in front of me.
But that's okay. It gives us the big picture. And it's very helpful to see that it's not done in a silo. Yeah, it's a very robust group of people who are looking at the guidelines and checking them to make sure that they are best practice, that they are accurate. And I had something else that came to mind. So then you have your AORN authors, perioperative nurses, background in the OR. They're working and pulling all this information together, putting these guidelines together. You've got your interdisciplinary team of other people, other groups who are looking at the guidelines as well and checking them and making sure that we are up to date on all of the best practice that we put in these guidelines. And then you also take the guidelines before they get released with their updates or before they come out, and they get put out for public comment for AORN members too, right?
Yes. Every guideline and also every position statement is put up for public comment. Guidelines are up for a minimum of 30 days, and we do encourage everyone to comment. So public comment doesn't mean that just perioperative nurses can comment, doesn't mean that just AORN members can comment. It means everyone can comment. And the comments that we receive actually help us a lot. So let me back up just a minute. So the public commenting period is a time where users of the guideline can read it, think about how they could integrate it into their practice, and help us identify areas where it's unclear. So one of the biggest benefits of public commenting is that it makes it clear to us when we are being unclear. So if we get comments that this would never work in my practice situation because of X, and we didn't mean X, we meant something else, it makes it easy for us to see this portion and this language that we've used, because words matter a lot. The language that we've used was not clear to this person. Now, that's one thing. Now, if we get a collection of comments that are similar about a portion of the guideline being unclear, then that matters a lot, because not only does one person not understand it or took it the wrong way, a collection of people did. And that lets us know that we need to really clarify our language. We have to go the extra mile to make sure that the language is clear and is implementable, if that's a word, in a variety of practice settings, from rural settings all the way to academic settings and level 1 trauma centers. And not just in the United States, but also around the world. We have international users of our guidelines, and other countries and other nursing associations in other countries look to us for guidance, and they look to our guidelines for that evidence basis for their practice as well.
So as we talk about the guidelines, we've really explored kind of everything that goes into it from the expertise side of it and all of the people who have a hand in making these guidelines come to life. There are some common misunderstandings, though, about the guidelines. And I wanted to talk a little bit about those misunderstandings so that we could maybe add some clarity, add some clarification. The first one really being what the guidelines are versus what they're not. Can you help us break down what they do versus what they don't do when we're talking about the guidelines?
Oh, wow, that's a really big question, and I love it. I love everything about it. So the guidelines are a collection of evidence-based practice recommendations. Now, there has been some confusion about who the intended audience is. There are some who believe that it's intended for perioperative nurses only, and that's not the case. The guidelines are intended for people who practice in the perioperative setting collectively. So Perioperative teams, that's our audience, not just perioperative nurses, because it takes the team to implement evidence-based practices. You can't do it alone. Nurses can't do it by themselves. Surgeons can't do it by themselves. Anesthesia providers can't do it by themselves, and neither can surgical techs or anyone else who works in that space. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception about our guidelines, is that they're only for nurses. They're for everyone. And the evidence that we use to inform the guidelines isn't just nursing evidence. In fact, we draw on evidence from a variety of disciplines. We draw on medical literature. We draw on quality improvement literature. We're in the middle of developing a guideline for use of artificial intelligence in the perioperative practice area. So that's a whole new layer of scientific evidence that we're including in our systematic review. The guidelines are not just a collection of practice recommendations that some really seasoned nurses got together and decided would be a good idea. That's not what they are. They are rooted in the evidence. And the language that gets massaged after public comment, it's the language that gets massaged, not the content. So public commenting is intended to clarify language, not to add practice recommendations that weren't supported by the literature. And that's part of the reason that we invite our public commenters to always submit scientific backing in the form of literature to support their stance. If they have access to some literature that we somehow didn't get in our systematic review, not that happens very often. I've not seen it much at all, but it could happen that maybe we missed a collection of articles that was published in a place that we didn't look. I don't see that happening very often because our librarian is such a wonderful sleuth. And while we're talking about expertise, I just want to highlight her for a second. She has a perioperative nursing background and she has a master's of library science. So we call her our unicorn, because that's kind of a rare combination. And having that expertise in building out our systematic reviews that support our evidence-based guidelines is absolutely essential. And she does an enormous and fantastic job of it.
Yeah, I can second that. When I was at AORN headquarters in Denver this past spring, and also last year when I was there for nominating committee orientations and meetings, I got to meet her, and she was introduced to me as the unicorn in the office because of her unique skill set, but also just the talent that she has and her ability to source all of that information that goes into these guidelines. And it was really neat to see the library that you have at the AORN headquarters as well, and just kind of get more behind the scenes and see what's going on. The next question that I have about misunderstandings is, are guidelines the same as policies?
No, they are not. They are not. So evidence-based guidelines are practice recommendations that can be implemented into policies. It's up to the organization to write policies that make sense for their teams and use language that makes sense for their practice area. So if you're thinking about the relationship between evidence-based guidelines and organizational policies, those guidelines should always inform policies, but they're not the same thing.
Right. A lot of times I will get at my facility where I work now, and the previous one, I would get, people that would bring up a guideline and, well, we have to do it this way. It's a guideline. I'm like, well, we also need to look at our policy. Like we need to follow the steps. The guideline can influence the policy and inform the policy, but understanding where your hospital policy falls and all of those things is crucial to understanding the bigger picture. And then there's also a language difference where we have, some people say guidelines, some people say standard, some people say recommendation. What are the differences in those words as they get thrown around? Is there a difference? Does it matter?
Well, let's circle back to something that you just said before we move into that. I definitely want to answer that question. You ask such wonderful, beautiful questions with so many layers. The distinction between a guideline and a policy. So if you're in a situation in your workplace where the guideline makes a practice recommendations to do something and the organization doesn't have a policy about it, then that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. You should do it. You should look at the evidence-based practice recommendations, which are found in the guidelines, and implement those into practice, whether they're part of your policy or not. Now, if you do have a policy at your organization that is at odds with the AORN guidelines, then I would invite that team and that organization to take a look at when the last time that policy was updated. When was it updated? Was it 1976? I mean, I've worked in some organizations in my distant past where some policies didn't they got the stamp of renewal, but
right. Without the
they
stamp
hadn't
of
actually
review.
been reviewed.
Yeah.
And but they hadn't been actually reviewed and updated in a number of years. And that's a problem because it creates confusion for organizations and for people who are trying to work in those environments. So it's really essential that policies follow evidence basis and the AORN guidelines and other evidence-based practice guidelines, and that organizations have a culture and a system in place so that it actually does happen.
No, it's an onion, right? There's so many layers, and you can dive into it and then go deeper and deeper. But ultimately, we want our policies influenced by best practice, and accessing the guidelines, which are a source of best practice, is a great way to make sure our policies are up to date and following best practice and up to standard. So then, if we go, I just use the word standard again, as if we look at these words. Is there a difference between saying the guidelines, standards, recommendations? Are they different? They're the same?
That we actually have, they're different. We actually have another document which most of your audience probably is familiar with. It's called Perioperative Nursing Scope and Standards of Practice. So that's when we talk about standards, we're talking about that resource. So the scope and standard of practice, together with evidence-based practice recommendations, which are found in the guidelines, are AORN's official stance on all areas of clinical practice in the perioperative area. So standards are not the same as guidelines. Practice recommendations, it can become confusing. When AORN talks about practice recommendations, we are talking about evidence-based practice recommendations and the guidelines for perioperative practice collection. Now, universally, if you're talking with someone who's not a diehard AORN-E, then if you talk about practice recommendations, they don't automatically think AORN guidelines. They think about, okay, so this is a practice recommendation that's come from any source. So sometimes practice recommendations come in the form of consensus standards that come out of different organizations. And sometimes practice recommendations come from agencies that are associated with the US government. And they may or may not have always a solid foundation of up-to-date scientific evidence. That's why it's really important to understand how guidelines are developed and how practice recommendations that come from other locations are developed, so you know how trustworthy those are. And I'm going to circle back to what we started on, which was there's guidelines for guideline development. And the elements of trustworthy guideline development are clearly outlined in the 2011 National Institute of Medicine. The National Academies of Medicine Clinical Practice Guidelines We Can Trust outline the elements of trustworthy guidelines, and they include transparency, managing conflict of interest, including financial bias that could be introduced, which is why we keep a very solid separation between our industry partners and the guideline development process, because we feel very strongly that managing that conflict of interest is imperative. The third thing is that it needs to involve a multidisciplinary group in developing the guideline. It has to be built on a systematic review of current scientific evidence. It must have a method for rating recommendations so that the reader understands when a recommendation is made, what kind of evidence was supporting that. It has to be clearly articulated. It has to have an element of external review, which is where the public commenting period comes in. And it has to be updated on a schedule of at least every 5 years to be considered by the National Academies of Medicine a clinical practice guideline that we can trust.
Okay. So you mentioned updates, which of course makes me think, we just got a whole slew of updates this year for different guidelines. Can you tell me what guidelines are being updated that in the works for the next ones? What are y'all working on?
anyone could probably figure it out by looking at the publication history and just seeing which ones are 5 years old. My brain is typically several years ahead of where we are right now in strategy. So I'm always thinking about the entire collection and where we are and where we need to be and what's coming next. So let me open up my list. As of today, we are finishing up the guideline for autologous tissue. That one was approved by the GAB, our Guidelines Advisory Board, at the beginning of this month and is scheduled to be released in August of this year. The guideline for care and cleaning of surgical instruments was up for public comment from June to July. It is just about to be approved by the GAB here in August. It will be released on eGuidelines Plus in October. The next is electrosurgical safety. That draft was completed in July and public comment extends into August. So it just finished. We'll be sending that for GAB ballot in September, and it will be e-released on eGuidelines Plus in December. The next is the guideline for care of the patient receiving local only anesthesia. Finished up that draft at the end of July. Public comment is happening now from August into September. Ballot will be in October with e-release and publication in the new print book in January. We're also working in 2027 land. So
Wow.
guidelines that will be printed in 2027 are in process. We have four of those in process now. They're environmental cleaning. The new guideline, and this title is not final yet, so don't write it down or take it to the bank, but it's the guideline for artificial intelligence in the perioperative practice setting. Next is surgical specimen management and moderate sedation. So those are the ones that are in various stages of development now. So in the beginning of guidelines development, it's the structure is such that we conduct a systematic review of the evidence and then we read all of it, and organize it, all of it. And think about how, yes, it is a lot of reading, and we all love it so much. We are a group of super duper nerds. It's an incredible group to live in. But we read all of that literature and we think about the ways that the science informs practice, and we think about what's missing. So sometimes during that systematic review, we'll find that we'll do what we call snowballing. So we do a systematic review of the scientific evidence, and then we think, oh, there's this other thing that we need to also add to this because we read about it, learn about it, think about it, and it comes up in another piece of literature. So we'll then snowball and go after more scientific evidence. And it sometimes seems never ending because there's a lot to read and a lot to know and a lot to consume, but it's always worth it in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about all of this insight that we've gotten into the guidelines and how much work AORN as an organization and all of the guidelines authors and groups put into our guidelines, well, that leaves us with asking the question, how do I implement these in my facility? And so what advice or insight can you share that would help a facility as they were looking at maybe implementing a guideline update, or if they were wanting to update policies and they wanted to use the guidelines to influence their policies? What does that really look like, and what advice can you share for that?
That's such a wonderful question, and I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity to talk about our implementation tools. So these can be found on the AORN website. They're available to all members. So whether you're a subscriber to eGuidelines Plus or not, you can still get to the implementation tools for the guidelines. You can't read the full guideline unless you're a subscriber or your facility is a subscriber. And eGuidelines Plus has so many resources. It does house the guidelines, but it houses a ton of other resources too. So definitely go there if you have it. And if you don't have it, I would encourage every person who's listening to this podcast to go after having access to eGuidelines Plus. It's just such a wonderful resource. But you don't have to have that to get to the implementation tools. And so on the AORN website, you can navigate to Guidelines Essentials. And on that page, or in those pages, you can find policy templates, which are updated with every guideline update, just ready to go. They're in the form of Word documents that anyone can download and adapt to your facility's use. We would recommend using the verbiage that we've included, but then add some detail that's specific to your facility. We work really hard to make it easy for people. There's also PowerPoint templates and recorded webinars about the update, so teams can stay up to date about what's changed. There's short kind of executive summary type documents that list the key takeaways of the guidelines, and this generally includes things that are new to the guideline and also focuses in on the things that might not be new but are really still very relevant and essential to understand. So those key takeaways are really important too. So it doesn't matter what your role is. You can be a brand new circulating nurse that just got out of Periop 101. You can be a VP of perioperative services listening to this, and you might be wondering, how do I get this done in my facility? Well, if you're a frontline nurse, you have the power to go into the website, find the resources, and take them to your leaders and say, hey, did you know how easy this could be to integrate these policies and procedures, which are always updated with every guideline update, and then just take them right into your facility and have an updated evidence-based practice focused policy right in your hands without a whole lot of effort. It's just as simple as downloading it from the website. And if you're a leader, then you can get your hands on all of those things and implement them right away with the help of your team to massage them into a format that makes sense for you, and involve the educator on your team and just work the magic. Take the tools that we provided and put them into practice. And also let us know if you need help with that. We're here. So we have the nurse consult line. You can give us a shout on that number. The number's on the website. You can reach out to us in a variety of ways. Our customer service phone number is where a lot of requests come through. You can call that number. But the best way to get clinical feedback and to talk with one of the nurses is to call the consult line during the consult line hours. We dedicate our time during that time to answer those questions. So
I can second that, because I've had a guideline question before and I called straight to the nurse consult line, and the nurse that I talked to was helpful, gave me the information I needed, pointed me in the right direction. And actually, we kind of sat and had a conversation about the question and about the guideline and kind of threw some ideas back and forth about what we were really looking for and what we were getting after. And then I got the help I needed. So I can definitely be a cheerleader for the nurse consult line. It is a helpful tool that is available that AORN offers for sure. So while we're talking about the resources that AORN makes available to us and the ways that they make it possible to integrate these guidelines and implement these guidelines and the help that we're given, well, they also have AORN Guidelines workshops. And I just wanted to take a quick second to talk about them, because I've been to one the last 2 or 3 years, and I mean, really helpful information to get in, to be able to sit and listen to the guideline authors. You're there most of the time, and I've seen you and a few other people, to have those conversations and to talk about the updates, to learn about it. They're just overall good days. But I mean, besides me giving my shameless plug, what can you tell us about the guidelines workshops that we've got going on this year?
Well, Melanie, I'm so glad that you enjoy them so much. It really is music to my ears to hear your feedback, because we really enjoy them. They're very energizing to us. We love to interact with nurses and other disciplines. Sometimes we get people who are not nurses. Sometimes we get other perioperative team members who attend these just to come spend time with us and talk about topics that are really important to perioperative nurses. They're done on Saturdays. It's kind of an all-day-ish thing. We serve lunch. We do some presentations. We do some hands-on experiences. And we have a lot of really lovely and candid conversations among the people who are present. And it's always a lot of fun for us. We get a lot of really great feedback from people who attend. And this year, we will be in 6 cities. We'll be in San Diego, Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Portland this year. So we're really looking forward to talking about all of the usual topics that are requested. So we have topics that are requested for these workshops, and that's what we talk about. So we can't get enough of talking about retained surgical items, the issue of surgical smoke, electrosurgical safety, surgical site infection prevention, and ERAS. So those are some of the topics that we know that we're going to be covering. And sometimes we add some things along the way. And at this point, I'm not sure if that's a final list or if we're still going to be adding some other things, but it's always a good time.
Sure. Yeah. While we're recording this, the social media post just came out that the guidelines workshops are scheduled and that the registration link is coming soon. By the time you're hearing this in August, registration will be up and open. So check out aorn.org and look for those guidelines workshops so that you can get signed up for one that's close to you. Personally, I'm going to try to go to Dallas this year to go to that workshop. So if you want to join me, go to Dallas. But it definitely is worth your while to go. And it really is a good opportunity to sit and learn from the experts and just learn more about the guidelines and what's going on with best practice and the changes in our practice and all the different things that you just want to be up to date on. So, Erin, we have talked all things guidelines for the last 40 minutes or so. And I guess I'm as big a nerd as you are because I could sit here and have this conversation all day, but I guess we do have to end it because I have a time limit. So before we come to an end, is there any final advice or final thoughts you want to share with our listeners before we close for the day?
Yeah, two things actually. I want to extend an open invitation to go into our website and look at all of the resources that we have available that describe the guideline development process. So if you are a nerd and you can't wait to see how all of the things happen behind the scenes, go to aorn.org and navigate to the guidelines page and read our evidence tables. Look at our evidence review sections. Learn about Prisma 2020. There's a really brief infographic that describes how guidelines are developed. So just go to all of those things and take a look at it. In every chance that you get, integrate evidence into your everyday practice. You can do it yourself too. So you don't have to wait for the evidence to wind up in a guideline to know that there's a better way to do things. So you can look at the evidence yourself. There's ways to do that. And there's many organizations that are being very supportive of evidence-based practice decisions being made at the organizational level. I would encourage every person to participate in evidence-based practice and integrating that into your roles, whatever your role may be. And lastly, I just want to thank every person who's listening to this podcast, because the fact that you're here listening to Melanie talk about nerdy things tells me that you care a lot. You care a lot about your patients. You care about doing the best that you can with your teams. And that makes you my people. Thank you for being you.
Well, Erin, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, to shine a light more deeply into the guidelines so that we can understand their creation and their process and then how to implement them better. And just thanks for sharing your insight with us. It was a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It was a blast. I hope that we can do it again.
I hope we do too. Thanks. That was Erin Kyle, Editor-in-Chief of the AORN Guidelines for Perioperative Practice. And I cannot tell you how helpful it is to get to sit down with the editor-in-chief of the guidelines and learn more about everything that goes into their creation, into the writing of them, and also even into the checks and balances of them from the different groups that evaluate them, from the opportunity for public comment that we can have a part in. The guidelines are there to influence our practice, to point us in the direction of best practice, and then also to be that foundation that guides our policies and guides the things that we do in perioperative services so that we can provide the best patient care, the safest patient care every time that we have a patient roll into our OR. And so I really feel like this is just a great conversation to have that in our, done with that. And so as we think about learning something else, how do I do something? How do I implement the AORN guidelines? Erin really helped us see everything that goes into them, why we would even want to implement them, but also pointed us in the direction of AORN's website where we can find all of the resources available so that as we are going to change our policies, update policies, implement new guidelines, the resources are there. They're available to us. All we have to do is take advantage of them. And by taking advantage of all of the resources that AORN has to offer that they've made available to us, we can make sure that we are following the guidelines and implementing everything we can to ensure best practice for all of our patients. But that's going to do it for this week's episode. Stay tuned next week for our final episode of season 16 as we dive into education, staff engagement, and gamification. But for now, on behalf of Chris, myself, and our whole team, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.